Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Tortoise Climate Summit. It is a beautiful day, at least here in London. I'm beginning to enjoy and see people joining us from all over the world, and we are particularly excited about today's summit. Often when you hold these events, your focus is really the event, is what happens today. I can't remember a time where we've worked so hard or thought so much about a day which really isn't about today. It's about what happens from tomorrow, and particularly with a view to the next 6 months. I was talking to a friend of mine about what the job of journalism is, and they said, you know, there's a way in which you could make the case that journalism and humanity's fortunes really are only going to be decided by our relationship with three things in the next 50 years: silicon, DNA, and CO2. That you could organize all newsrooms around those three things: technology, health, and climate. But of course, the other two really wouldn't count for much if you don't resolve your relationship with CO2 and greenhouse gases, if you don't resolve your relationship with climate. And we've got a group of people joining us today who are going to help us understand not why we need to do that. I think that case is really overwhelmingly made, but how. And so we're particularly fortunate that this morning we start with Nigel Topping. Nigel, thank you for joining us. Nigel has, by any measure, the best title that I've come across: the high-level champion for climate action, COP26. Most people, Nigel, I think, would be happy with any combination of two of those their title, not all of them. I'm going to come to you, if I might, in 1 minute. I just wanted to introduce the sort of structure of the day and how things work so everyone knows what we're up to. The first point is just to say that the spirit of Tortoise is that we're an open and slow newsroom, and that openness is really important to us. We really want to hear from you. We want to hear your thoughts, expertise, observations. So we have a pretty loosely enforced rule that we don't want questions. We want people's points of view. Please weigh in. You'll see that my colleague Liz Mosley is marshalling the chat function, and she'll respond to you. I'll try and bring people into the conversation in the course of the day. So please do weigh in. The second thing is to say that, of course, we're recording the session, so please be aware that, you know, things that are said and shared may be shared more broadly on digital platforms beyond it. But I want to talk about something that we've done around this Tortoise Climate Summit and around the climate agenda that's different from some of the events we've done previously, which is we're trying to bring together a coalition around accelerating net zero. So we do go into the day with, and into this subject with, if you like, an agenda, an argument that we're not cutting emissions fast enough. And that actually we need to understand how we can accelerate the journey to net zero. And with that in mind, what we want to do journalistically is investigative journalism. We want to host more think-ins, more discussions that bring people in and challenge the ways in which we live and work to address the climate emergency. And for that to really work, we want to make sure that everyone gets a seat at the table. And we're bringing in campaigning organizations, policymakers and politicians, and big businesses too. And we really appreciate that in this effort already, you know, big and really influential companies like Capgemini, like Diageo and British Land, Glencore, the CBI, Santander, a whole host of people have already signed up to be part of our accelerating net zero coalition. And that's one of the things that we hope we'll drive from here to COP26 in November. Part of that is making sure that we keep an eye on what the data is, not just what companies say, but what they actually do. And after this session, I'm going to hand over to my colleagues Alexi Mostras and Alexandra Musavizadeh and Luke Bedimer to look at the Climate 100, our first cut of the Responsibility 100 Index, specifically looking at climate. So I hope that you can see this is not just a get together. I know there's a lot of talking around this subject. We don't want it just to be hot air. We want to make sure that what we do today results in action and results in a sense of change. So if you're interested in that, while we're talking, do go to the Tortoise website and you'll see there the accelerating net zero agenda. And as you can see too, my colleague Liz in the chat has provided the link. All right, with all of that put aside, let's start with actually perhaps not such a sunny question, Nigel. Why don't we start with a very simple question, which is, do you actually think COP26 is going to go ahead? Is the sense that it's going to be derailed or in some way minimized?
I mean, of course, it's an impossible question to answer given how volatile COVID-19 is and what's happening in India in particular. But I think the sense is that it's going to go ahead. The UK government, which holds the presidency of the COP, is determined to do that. It's working very closely with the authorities, both policing and public health in Scotland to figure out, obviously safety of participants is the number one concern. So yeah, my sense is that there's a very strong commitment to it going ahead, and that it will go ahead unless global events take a significant turn for the worse. But I think one thing that we can be sure is that whatever final form it takes, there will actually be much broader participation because we've all learned to hybridize events. And one of the exciting things is the extent to which we can have much more involvement from people who wouldn't be able to travel anyway, regardless of pandemic. So I think it's going to be an interesting new form of these kind of events, whatever happens.
So I started off by admiring teasingly the scale of your title. Actually, Nigel, when you were announced a year or so ago, I mean, it seemed as though it was quite an impossible task, i.e. how do you bring together the government machinery of this, business and society? Now you've been in the job for over a year now, I suppose. What do you understand the actual task, your task, to be?
The role I have was created as part of the Paris Agreement because the countries recognize that this is such a massive structural change to the global economy that it's a folly to think that national governments can do it on their own. I mean, both politically, governments can only go as fast as the economy and voters allow them to, right? Otherwise they trip up over going too fast. There was a lot of very smart elements to the Paris Agreement. I think that was one of them. It had been brewing for a few years, but 5 years before the Paris Agreement, it was sort of anathema to think that businesses and cities and investors might have any kind of role. Of course, they don't have a legal role in the agreement. So I'd seen that emerge as I was running the Women Business Coalition. So the role basically it's interestingly big and vaguely defined, right? So basically, it's like work with everybody who's not a national government to drive ambition and action on climate change in support of the Paris Agreement, and by doing that, try and support the countries to go further and faster. When I took the job, COVID was just emerging, right? So I didn't really expect to have a year like I have had.
So Nigel, can we come back to that point about the role of businesses and society, given that they're not bound into the COP process? But let's just talk about COP for a second. What do you think are the reasonable expectations of what come out of this?
Yeah, I think, many people listening will know in great detail what a COP is and isn't, but I think it's just worth reminding that we're not, this is why I like the idea of slow media, like taking the time to get it right, Jane, because this is not a renegotiation of the global climate deal. We're not going to have presidents and prime ministers renegotiating the objective. Paris was the treaty. It sets out a long-term goal and a process for ratcheting every 5 years to get there. So I always think of what's going on at the COP as sort of three levels. There are still things being negotiated, but they're largely the technical rules of the so-called Paris rule book. Stuff that's important, just like the details of disclosure and tax are important, but exactly rules on data and timeframes and some of the mechanisms for trading between countries. So that is happening, and that's really important because it's as proof that the multilateral system is working, and to give confidence to everybody else that the rules of the game are set. So on transparency, in particular. The second thing that's happening is this, and the reason why this is such an important COP is it's the first real test of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement sets this long-term goal of net zero and then says, and countries must come forward with plans every 5 years. And every 5 years, their plans have got to get more ambitious, or at least not backslide. There's a ratchet mechanism. So and we're in that period now. And obviously with the UK hosted summit in December and then the Biden summit, was it only last week?
Yeah.
Have been part of that. Countries coming forward, so the US, the UK 68%, EU 55%, America 52%, coming forward with their so-called nationally determined contributions. Most of that will be done by the time we get to Glasgow, although there might be one or two rabbits pulled out of a hat in Glasgow. And then there's everything that's going on in the real economy, which is a mixture of public, private, local, national, multinational. So that's more where I'm working, and lots of stuff like that will come to a crescendo in Glasgow, and will be more important in Glasgow than it was in Paris, because we're in the implementation phase now, not just the treatifying and promising stage.
So can I ask you just one element of that, Nigel, which is the nationally defined contributions. It's striking to me that one of the things we got used to in this pandemic year is access to comparable data. We actually look at infection rates and mortality rates, vaccination rollout rates, and have a sense of how countries are doing. My colleague Giles Whittell, who's really our sort of the kind of organizing brain behind what we do in terms of our coverage of our planet, wrote yesterday in a sense maker about what the meaning of those Biden commitments were. And there were clearly commitments there that were significant: the US, Japan, the UK. But it's hard to get a grip on how substantial they are, where the big holes in those commitments are. And I just wondered, for all of us who are trying to keep tally on whether we're making progress or whether we're just talking, how do you make a meaningful judgment on the NDCs?
Well, there's a lot of very good analysis done by organisations like the Rhodium Group and the Climate Action Tracker. So, like many people have my favourite sort of sources of people who unpick some of the complexity to compare, one country with another, or a newer NDC with an older one. I mean, one of the challenges, for example, is that countries use different baseline years. So, so the Japanese, the UK, and the American commitments don't all use different baseline years. So, but that analysis all gets done very quickly by scientists who are working, sort of public scientists who are working to do that translation work.
But it's not but in the end, presumably, it will be the job of COP26 to determine what those commitments are and what the outcomes will mean as a result of them.
No. The COP process, the Conference of the Parties, right? That's all it stands for, which means all the countries who are signatories to the UN Climate Convention, that they have, they require certain bits of analysis to be done. So they require the international scientific community to do a report every few years. The sixth version of that is starting to come out this year, so we'll see some of the next wave of scientific reports this year. And then in 2023 they've made a decision that there will be a global stock take. The idea being that that's the stock take ahead of the 2025 ratchet period. So it'll be all sorts of people are doing assessments. So the United Nations Environment Programme does an annual review of progress, as does Climate Action Tracker and others. So there are lots of people doing it, but it's not actually the job of the COP to do that. They might decide that to ask someone to do that, as they have asked the international scientific community to do a review of the science, and mandated this stock take in 2023, and then there'll be another one in 20. So the idea is you'll have a stock taken 2 years ahead of the ratchet period. So stock take in 2023, ratchet 2025, stock take 2028, ratchet 2030.
Oh, okay, I see. And Nigel, people who followed you personally, who've seen your career, would say, look, you've been around this subject for years, and I think there were periods of real despondency where the science was all pointing one way and the politics was mouthing the words but not really delivering. You can't help feeling, given what you saw last week, that there is something really fundamental that has shifted.
Oh yeah,
in politics and in business too, and in society too. The question is, to our central kind of theme of the day, is are we cutting fast enough? And what should we do?
Unequivocally, no. Right, emissions are still rising. We'll bounce back from the pandemic in emissions. Of course, there's an artificial dip in trend-wise, an artificial dip as a result of the slowdown in economic activity because of the pandemic, but we'll bounce right back. So we're in a, it's a crisis. We're overshooting what the planet can cope with. It's already leading to extreme weather events all over the world, and they're all going to get worse. And the science is clear. We need to cut by at least 50% this decade. So more and more, I think there's a focus. The big change that you're right is that everyone's realized we've got to get to zero, right? The scientists have been saying it for a long time, but really only starkly from the end of 2018 when they published a report on the difference between 1.5 degrees, which means net zero by 2050, and 2 degrees, which means net zero towards later on in the century. And every 0.1 of a degree is masses of economic damage and human suffering. So in those 2 years, we've suddenly seen everybody really coalescing on, okay, we all got to get to net zero. So all the G7 countries now are committed to net zero 2050, and many, many other countries beside, which means that actually with this ratchet process, we'll end up, I think we'll end up coalescing around somewhere between 2035 and 2045 as we also get more confident in our ability to innovate. But the key is how fast we act in the next 10 years. It's not about whether it's 2045 or 2050, because it's the total emissions, it's the area under the curve. So you can't just do nothing for 30 years and then jump to zero. You've got to make deep cuts now. So the real focus is on what we do in the next 10 years. And we're not doing enough yet.
So our spirit, this focus on accelerating net zero is right, isn't it? The risk of 2050 is that it lets people off the hook in the 2020s. You'd share that view. Absolutely. Anyone who says that they're committed to net zero, ask them what they're doing in the next 5 years. I mean, we have this race to zero, and it's about making your long-term commitment, but then saying what your short-term plan is. A long-term commitment without a short-term plan is just hot air. Right. I'm going to start bringing some people in, if I might, Nigel, because I want to make sure that in the course of today we hear from as many people as possible. I'm going to start, if I might, with Richard Whitaker, who's just asked a question. Actually, Richard, you're going to make the point better than I am. Richard, what's on your mind?
Sure, thank you. So we see all in these targets that people have set. Yeah, we're going to reduce these, temperature, we're going to reduce emissions, we're going to aim for low temperature, but actually how countries are actually going to do it, the transition pathways that they have to actually achieve these targets seems really unclear to me and maybe to others as well. So I'd like to ask basically, will COP26 be focusing on the need to actually set out transition pathways rather than just targets?
Thanks, Richard.
Really, that's a really good question, Richard. And the answer is kind of yes and no. So again, in the formal COP26, will not renegotiate a requirement for more detail, right? That's basically been set. There are some things they're finalising in terms of what data and when. And so one of the things which Paris did was actually unlock the geopolitics by saying everybody come forward with your own best plan. That might seem a bit loosey-goosey, but the alternative of trying to get 196 countries to each negotiate each other's plans is, the combinatorics are pretty horrible, and the negotiations proved impossible because you only have to be pissed off with one other person's plan and you can bring the whole thing down because it's consensus based. But so no in the sense of the formal negotiations, I think, Richard, but yes in the sense that more and more that's what the conversation is about. And certainly that's what we're really trying to drive in our role as champions. Is great, we want you to join the race to zero, but you don't just say you're going to be there in 2050, 5 CEOs or 5 mayors or 10 mayors down the road. What's your lap time that you're going to do in the next 5 years? If you have a race analogy, you've got to be running fast enough to still be in the race. And so a lot of work has been going on in the last few years on pathways at national levels. Like the Danes have done an amazing job. They've got like 13 sectoral collaborations. In our work with this coalition of 320 NGOs, we publish pathways for every sector. And a lot of what we're trying to do is now get everyone to converge on those pathways. So I'll give you a simple example from just 2 days ago. Aviation, very difficult to decarbonize, right? Basically, four routes, more efficient airframes, better air traffic control. But the two technological ones are electric aviation for short haul. Norway's committed to all domestic flights being electric by 2040, and sustainable aviation fuel for long haul. Currently, 0.01% of aviation fuel is sustainable. The rest of it's just kerosene, right? So that's a real exponential challenge because sustainable aviation fuel is much more expensive. So one of the things we've done is really try and say, what is the S curve of the exponential adoption curve? And what we're trying to do is get everyone to agree on 2% by 2025. Again, sounds low, but it's 200 times right, growth, and then 10% by 2030. Interesting, just yesterday or the day before, IAG, which includes BA, one of the big airline groups, are committing to and advocating for 10% by 2030. So what we're trying to do is get everyone to agree on that, and then the fuel producers, the airlines, the airports, and national governments, if they all agree on that, then we'll do that. Same in shipping, same in hydrogen, same in many of these other technologies that are earlier stage. So, Richard, pathways is going to be the real key to all the conversations. Can we converge on a pathway pre-competitively? And I think actually I'm really optimistic. There's a lot of really good work going on. A lot more need to be done, but that's much more. My vision would be that the COPs become much more about those pathways, what's already happening and what needs to happen.
Richard, thank you. Nigel, Maggie Hobbs asked a question, and it's actually really interesting how many people are interested in how this gets communicated. Obviously, I'm inevitably interested in the role of the media in this. Maggie, your question was, I saw in the chat, was about the role of the media, but I'm interested to know sort of what prompts you to ask that question and think about that issue.
Morning, Nigel. So yes, I suppose for me, I'm an avid tortoise thinking watcher, and I go to a lot of other equivalent kind of thinkings in different medias. And I suppose for me, it was like, what would Nigel like to see someone like Tortoise doing in terms of the communication? Because it feels like there's a very huge frustration building up for people about what they're meant to do and how the media should be playing a part in changing our behavior.
Well, yeah, really good question. And two pleas to the media, well, three. If I might warm up and get to four. My list of three often have at least four items in. Yeah, the three would be one, educate yourselves around what the COP is and isn't. Like every time I see someone in the media saying world leaders are going to come together to renegotiate the global climate deal, I'm like, come on, just every 6-year-old who's read anything about the COP knows that's not true. So just be a proper journalist. Do your very, very basic research. Two, a plea against the if it bleeds, it leads obsession of sort of clickbait media who are looking for conflict rather than convergence and collaboration. There's both. Be balanced. Don't just look for the one bit of conflict and make that the whole story. Good example would be in Madrid. Okay, in Madrid at the COP25, there was conflict over the so-called Article 6, which is the bit of the rule book about international carbon trading. It's important for the multilateral process. It won't actually make that much difference globally to the amount of money which is spent or to emissions reductions. It's about fair and robust accounting in certain circumstances. At the same time as that negotiation wasn't concluding because of conflict, the entire continent of Europe committed to go net zero by 2050. But the media chose the former immaterial, irrelevant story as the story about. That's really irresponsible, right? Because it doesn't tell the story of what's actually happening in the world. And then the third thing I would say is to educate yourselves about the way that the future actually comes forward, particularly technologically, particularly exponential change. So when I hear even esteemed organs like the FT saying we're only at 5% of electric vehicles, rather than, oh my God, we're at 5% now and we're only at 2.5, 12 months ago, it's doubling every 12 months. There's so much ignorance about the way that changes, and that's in the media, and it's in a lot of people who are talking about the future. So learn to spot signs of radical change coming and track them, because that's the way industrial disruption happens exponentially, always has done, always will do. We got some pretty iron cast rules of that, and look for that, and don't believe silly forecasts of the future like the IEA's current policy scenario, which models what the future will be like if no one changed policies at all after today. I mean, that's just a stupid construct. Call it out for what it is. I mean, they say it's just a scenario, but it's a stupid scenario because it gives the impression that that's actually a likely or plausible future, when I don't think there's any world in which policymaking stops tomorrow.
Okay. I want to bring in a few more people. Abby Sims, you had a point which is an extension of this, which is how the world communicates.
Yeah, I was just interested in, I think there's a lot of talk of COP26, and obviously at, government level and business and sort of all the responsibilities, but how you communicate and translate that down to individuals, groups, communities, kind of getting that collective responsibility. And I think it's a case of, it's one of those things, you know, as ex-media myself, is that you jump onto a subject and then you almost switch off after that. And it's how do you then make what is happening relevant to everyone, because everyone's got a role in this.
Abby, thank you. Nigel, before you reply, I'm just going to, there are a couple of other points, just given the time, I want to make sure I bring a couple of other people. I'm not sure whether John Drummond is there, an interesting point about social change. I'm just going to go to John Saws, who I can see is there. Good morning, John. You were making a point about the Biden commitments of last week.
Yeah, thanks, James, and thanks, Nigel. We've been very focused in Europe on carbon trading and having a carbon tax as a way to change consumer behavior. But the Biden administration, for all its good language and good commitments on climate, seems to have dodged and swerved around the idea of a carbon tax. Do you, Nigel, think it's possible for the United States to meet its new commitments without that sort of measure to change consumer behavior?
Okay.
And I'm going to see if I can get John Drummond. Yes, you're there, John. Briefly, the point you were going to make.
Yeah, just that it's clear to me that behavior change is a major element of addressing emission reductions. And I'm interested in Nigel's view on how to use the platform of COP26 to more successfully engage the public.
John, thank you very much. A proper all-you-can-eat buffet of issues.
Okay, let me try and deal with them in order. I mean, the sort of individual and collective responsibility, I think, that'd be a really good question, because it's kind of be overwhelming, right? So there's lots of good stuff happening. There's a great sort of campaign of campaigns called Count Us In, which is really trying to focus on the individual level. What can individuals do? And that's so I would point to that. Then there's some really good, like I think it's Let's Go to Zero, which is a schools campaign with a schools kit. That's one of my favorites. Imagine if every school in the UK was working as a school community to get to net zero 2030. What an amazing lab. So that means within 10 years, every single person under the age of 20 would have educational experience of being part of a community grappling with the challenges in the school building, in how parents take kids to work or accompany them on walking or biking or sharing, in how the school grows food and what the diet is in the school. So that all those individual changes which people can make are explored in the lab. So I think that there's lots of opportunities for that now with universities and schools and small companies all committing to net zero and all having to grapple themselves with what changes they make. I mean that speaks a little bit to John's point about behavior change, because it's much easier to change behavior when you're part of a peer group moving. I think, John, the attempt will be to make the COP really very inclusive, and again, depending on how much it's virtual, how much is in person, but certainly we're speaking regularly with, for example, Stop Climate Chaos Scotland, which is a coalition of the civil society groups in Scotland who are organising a climate fringe, riffing off the idea of the Fringe Festival in Edinburgh, to make sure that it's not just about esoteric negotiating points, but that the issues of individual and collective behaviour change, as well as technology, are all being addressed. On the carbon tax point, look, first of all, carbon tax is not a good means of changing consumer behaviour. Generally speaking, it's a good means of changing business behaviour, and it only tends to work in certain sectors. And I could talk for a long time about that. But the two really big things that Biden is pushing are phasing out combustion engines by 2035 and a zero carbon grid by 2035. Carbon taxes are a bad mechanism for trying to change the direction of car production and buying, because a $50 a ton on carbon only adds about $100 per year to the running costs of a mid-size family car. In other words, it makes zero. It's a zero marginal. So you'd have to have thousands of dollars a ton. So that's why people use emission standards, which Obama did. They were rolled back. They're coming back in a vengeance. And of course, if you say, like the UK, that you can't sell a combustion engine car after 2030, then you've got an infinite price of carbon. So I think on the power system, it's where it's more relevant, because we know that an adequate price on carbon kills coal, pushes you to gas, and then moves away. So I think, John, there are other ways of doing that, like with renewable portfolio standards or average emission standards. And it's political as much as anything right now. There is quite strong Republican support for a carbon tax in the USA. So I think it's possible that the US will go down a carbon tax route, but there's also other policy instruments that you can use and that have been used effectively to make those transitions.
So sorry, Nigel, are you saying that you actually don't think a carbon tax is either easily achievable or necessary?
I think a carbon tax is a great idea. It's not necessary because there are other ways of having implicit carbon taxes, like through product standards or portfolio standards. There's Michael Grubb, I think, has done. If you think about if you think about a marginal abatement curve, which says, what's the cost of all the different abatement activities to reduce carbon, there's a bunch of activities which have a net positive value of doing them. So classical economic theory would say they should have happened already. All right. Well, that's because we know that classical economic theory is wrong, because people don't just buy things because of rational reasons; they buy them for irrational reasons. So cars would be a good example. Every fleet owner should have already moved to electric because the total cost of ownership of fleet of electric vehicles is already lower than the cost of a combustion engine. So a carbon price doesn't work when it's behavioural. You need to move to standards or other nudges. At the other end of the spectrum, it would cost so much that it would be politically unfeasible. If you need like a $300 a ton price on carbon, then you won't. So there's a sweet spot where a carbon price that is politically acceptable changes the economics when it's B2B. So coal to gas is a good example. And so the UK's decision to have a carbon floor price of £18 really helped end coal early. We will now end coal in 2024. But then ultimately they had an infinite price of carbon saying, well, you won't be allowed to burn coal in 2025. So it's a really powerful tool, but it's complex. It doesn't always work. And there are these issues around carbon leakage if you've got mobile industries which you might push over the border. And that's why the EU is talking about border adjustment measures, because what you don't want to do is reduce the emissions in your own boundary and push something polluting over the boundary because you've put a tax on it, and then end up importing higher carbon stuff, which is why they end up with the idea of carbon avoidance measures.
So look, I appreciate we're running over by a couple of minutes, but Nigel, this is one of these really, really big subjects, carbon taxes. And I think people like me who are trying to learn their way in, trying to do what you say, educate your way in, seize upon something like a carbon tax because it feels like it's a measure that will affect, to John Drummond's point, consumer behavior as well as corporate behavior. Is what you're saying, am I right in reading that what you're saying is that you can go a long way to delivering the outcomes of a carbon tax by introducing sector by sector industry standards? You shouldn't abandon the carbon tax aspiration, but the standards can get you a long way there without necessarily getting the consensus on a carbon tax.
Yes. And sometimes you need other instruments, like when we're talking about technologies which are at an early stage, take green hydrogen. Green hydrogen is much more expensive than hydrogen made from fossil sources. So there are other measures that governments can do, like incentivizing R&D, or like actually investing in early stage projects, which we know are necessary to start getting down the cost curve. So, people do get religion on carbon pricing, and you hear really silly things from economists you should know better, like all we need is an internationally agreed Pigouvian price on carbon, right? So the only problems with that is, like, internationally agreed. We have no internationally agreed fiscal measures. That's politically, it's sort of fantasy. You can't calculate it, right? Because it's so. I mean, you can, but that will be contested. And it doesn't work in all circumstances. So it's a sort of it risks being a naive fantasy, but it is a really powerful tool. We see it in the EU now with the carbon pricing in the ETS getting close to $50. That's really material for a lot of industry. So it is incentivizing investment in the clean alternatives in power and in heavy industry. But you have to get into the nuances of it. There's no simple silver bullet.
Well, I have to tell you, my co-founder Katie Vanek Smith will like this because she always says the answers to most things are and. So in this case, I suppose that's the conclusion of this. Nigel, I want to just thank you chiefly actually for helping me through something that I found really difficult, journalistically really difficult through kind of more than a decade of this, which is that I think newsrooms really struggle with anything long term, right? And by long term, we mean a week, right? Let alone, you know, a decade or 3 decades. And so I suppose the central thing I will take away from this is when I get into a conversation with anyone of influence about climate, I'll feel comfortable about asking the question, not what are your plans for 2050, but to use your phrase, what are you doing in the next 5 years?
Yeah, and get used to harvesting evidence of that kind of short-term behavior, which is consistent. So just 2 examples. So I'm kind of hyper tuned to these, right? But 2 examples in the last 2 days. The IAG group talking about 10% sustainable aviation fuel. It feels a bit prosaic, right? But that is radical change. That's 1,000 times the level of sustainable aviation fuel. Why isn't everybody else doing that? Oh, interestingly, the French made that a condition of the bailout of Air France. So you start, you know, that's news because it's happening right now. Or Moody's 2 days ago saying, as a result of the massive Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero we launched with Mark Carney last week with 160 firms with $70 trillion of assets saying we're committed to net zero. Moody's saying that credit is going to get squeezed for heavy emitting companies who don't have a short-term plan. So there's news, if you want to look for it, about the evidence of that momentum building, which talks to a future, but doesn't have you only being in a loosey-goosey 2050s conversation.
Well, I mean, in a very practical terms, Nigel, I should say it's really helpful for us because we'll be launching from here weekly an accelerating net zero sense maker on weekly newsletter.
Right.
And Giles Whittell, who's the editor of it, has the chance actually to identify those things. And actually, I think you're right. We journalistically really struggle with the idea of exponential changes. Right? We're much more comfortable.
It's not just journalists. It's economists, business leaders, policymakers. I mean, humans are cognitively wired to think linearly, right? So you have to really over-educate and over-look for it. But if you actually do some research into the historical pattern of disruptive change, horses to cars, valves to transistors, landlines to mobile. I mean, everything. This always happens. I speak. Michael Liebrich from Bloomberg New Energy says it's like a sneeze where you're kind of like waiting forever, and then suddenly it takes off. So you think it's never going to happen, and then boom, it's over. And so my point to business leaders always is, if you think you can manage the rate of change, and you don't believe it's going to go much faster, you're going to look at every single CEO in the automotive company in the automotive world right now. If you get them in a quiet private moment, will say they wish they'd started electrifying 5 or 10 years earlier. Yeah. In public, they'll say, of course, we didn't want to do it too soon. We didn't want to waste, but they're all behind Tesla and the Chinese and playing a massive game of catch up. Okay.
Well, Nigel Topping, thank you. As you can see, there is something also really exciting about this because it's gone from arguing about the is it or isn't it into the how and seeing things like that. And even just your point on IAG is fascinating there. So a heartfelt thank you to you, Nigel, and also a heartfelt apology to my colleague, Alexi Mostras, because the standing joke in Tortoise is that I have a struggle with time. We are focused on what's happening in the short term. In the very short term, I should say that I'm late. Nigel Topping, many thanks.